Hey family, we are back with this week's Digital Disciple. We have been studying the book of Ephesians. This is session 6 in this series. Now, I am Pastor Travis, and I am so glad you decided to join us tonight. Now do me a favor and drop a comment below and let me know that you are joining me tonight. All right, go ahead and grab your Bibles, get that cup of coffee, and sit down in your favorite comfy chair, and let's get started tonight. I want to start off this session with a question. What is it that sets Christianity apart from every other religion? You know, this is one of the most common things that I hear about religions. I am sure you hear it too. All religions basically teach the same thing. You know, be nice, be honest, don't steal. There's really no difference. Have you ever heard that before? Or is there? Now, Paul is going to show us something in Ephesians 4 that fundamentally and absolutely separates the Christian message from every other religious message in the world. In fact, in many ways, it turns religion upside down. Now, we will get there eventually, but Paul is going to start his discussion on why Christians do good here in chapter 4, verse 17. Now, this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do. Now, a little note here, whenever Paul says Gentiles in the book of Ephesians, he's referring to anybody that had no God. You see, Gentiles in the Old Testament was the name for anybody outside of the saving covenant that God had given to Israel. So now, Paul uses that term to just mean anybody that's outside of faith in God. He said, you used to be Gentiles, and then he gives them a description of what Gentile life or life without God looks like. In verse 19, it says, they, the Gentiles, have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. Greedy, that's the language of craving. You see, they're hungry for the sensual pleasures that they feel. Like, they have to have them in order for life to be worth living. So they give themselves entirely to the pursuit of these pleasures. He's describing people who feel like they just can't say no to their desires. You know, that guy, for example, who just can't say no to porn. For him, it is more than just lust. It's an escape. It's a way to find comfort, to relieve stress, to add excitement to an otherwise meaningless life. Or the person who runs to drugs and alcohol for refuge. It's more than just a bodily urge or a desire to get high. You see, elsewhere, Paul's going to use the word Epithumia, which we always just translated in our English Bibles as lust, but it literally means a hyper craving for something. If something may be a good thing, but you say about that thing, I just gotta have that, because without that, life would not even be worth living. It could be good things like money, like sex, like romantic love, or family, or the approval of others. None of these things in themselves are bad. But the thought of being without these things produces despair in our hearts, so that we're greedy for them. Now, that's what Paul is talking about here. Where does Paul say that these cravings come from? Well, we will look at verse 18. He says, they come because we are alienated from the life of God. Now, these cravings arrive from the absence of God in our lives. You see, the Bible teaches that we were created for God, by God, for God. And when we were one with God, our hearts were satisfied and filled up in Him. But when we rejected God, we lost that essential, life-giving, soul-satisfying relationship. And Blaise Pascal famously called it the God-shaped hole that exists in every human heart. Pascal said that we had this void in our heart and we can't figure out where it comes from. And so we spend all of our lives trying to fill that hole. You see, we try family, we try money, we try approval, we've tried drugs and alcohol. See, we know we are missing something. We may not even realize what it is or how we got to a place where we feel like we're missing something. But we know that something in our soul isn't in the right place. And while we're searching for this thing, Paul is showing us it is God. It's God's affirmation. It's God's presence. It's God's love that is the solution for our problem. In verse 21, a new knowledge of God that gives us, verse 23 says, a renewed heart to delight in God. In other words, we need not to have simple behavior reform. We need a new heart that wants to obey and love God again, that seeks God because it craves God. And where does that new heart come from? It comes from two places, Paul tells us here in Ephesians. First, in verse 21, and this is so good. Verse 21 says, assuming you have heard about Him and were taught in Him, as the truth is in Jesus. You see, scholars tells us that whenever Paul refers to Jesus Christ, he almost always uses the term Christ. Whenever Paul uses the term Jesus by itself, he almost always is referring to Jesus in his life on earth. The Nazarene baby born in Bethlehem, who lived as a carpenter, who worked miracles in his lifetime, and then he died on the cross for us. So Paul is saying that we get this new heart from learning the story, the historical story, and Jesus's life and death. So that's the first place. It's in the story of Jesus. We see the beauty of God on display, and in seeing the beauty of God, we are changed from the inside. Even though we are hard to change sometimes, you know, if you've ever been to a theater and watched one of those epic movies, now see, the plot in most of those epic stories is basically the same. Now for this example, let's take Lord of the Rings. We have a regular guy, and in this case it's Frodo Baggins, who gets swept up into this gigantic drama that is just so much bigger than what he is. And in that drama, he experiences real danger and encounters real beauty, the likes of which he has never seen before in his own world. And that experience changes him fundamentally. That's what happens when you meet God. And the story of Jesus is a story with such beauty and such power and such drama in it that we have never seen before in our lifetime, that just getting swept up into it forever changes our lives. It's not behavior modifications, it's solid transformation at the very core level. So the first way this change happens in our life is as we learn the story of Jesus. The second element Paul gives us is in verse 23. He says we need to be renewed in the spirit of our minds. You need not only new knowledge, you need a new spirit. This is why Paul prays for them twice in Ephesians. He's like, God is going to give you the eyes to be able to see this. So the second place we get this new heart is by the Spirit. So here's our definition of biblical change. The kind of change that Paul is going after, it's when the Spirit of God uses the story of God to make the beauty of God come alive in our hearts. And that's really the whole big idea of Ephesians. That is why these moral instructions that Paul is giving us come in chapter 4, not in chapter 1 of Ephesians. Because it's only after saturating ourselves and our hearts in the gospel for 3 whole chapters, and only after the Spirit of God has renewed our hearts, according to these prayers, will our hearts be changed forever. What Paul is going to do now, after he explains this, he's going to, in these verses, give a couple of examples of what gospel change looks like in our lives. A couple of test cases, if you will, to show you whether or not you've actually had the metal of your heart transformed by the gospel. And Paul's not trying to give an exhaustive list here. He's just saying this is what your life will begin to look like once the gospel transforms you. Now here's the first one in verse 32. It says, be kind to one another. Be tender-hearted. Be forgiving of one another, just like God in Christ forgave you. Now see, Paul is not just commanding us to be kind and to forgive. In many ways, you can't be just commanded to forgive or to love somebody. He says, you do this because of how God has forgiven you. And here's Jesus' way of explaining this. He said, Jesus told the story one time of a man who owed another man 10,000 talents. Now, 10,000 was the highest number you could count to in Greek. So to say 10,000 was like saying infinity. Now that many talents was, let's say, a month's wages. Well, on the day that this man's debt is due, he doesn't have the money to pay it. He owes an infinity of money. So he falls on his knees in front of this guy who's loaning the money. He begins to just weep and says, give me, I plead with you, just give me one more week. Give me one more week and I'll pay you back every penny that I owe you. Now see, the lender looks at this man and he shakes his head. He says to this man, he said, no, stand up. He says, you don't have another week to pay me back because you don't owe me any more money. As of right now, I have forgiven all of your debt entirely. Now see the crowd. Nobody in the crowd can believe it. Certainly not the man who owed the money. Everybody's kind of looking around at each other like, what just happened? And the man that owed the money stands up and says, are you serious? And the lender says, yeah, I forgive your debt entirely. You owe me nothing else. Now see, the man who owed the money feels light as air and he's walking outside after he just got forgiven an infinity of debt. And as he's walking outside, he sees a friend of his crossing the street. And let's just say this guy owes him $1.50 for a Mountain Dew from the week before. And he says, hey man, where's my money? Where is my $1.50? And his friend says, man, I'm sorry, it's been a tough week. I don't have any cash and I can't pay you back your $1.50. And here's what happens in Jesus' story. This guy that has been forgiven his debt goes over and grabs him by the collar and says, you don't have my $1.50? I'm going to throw you in debtor's prison. Can you imagine when Jesus is telling this story? Everybody is shaking their head and says, that's ridiculous. No person who has just been forgiven 10,000 talents and infinity of money would hold somebody else responsible for $1.50 that he borrowed for a Mountain Dew. Now, this was Jesus' point exactly. So if you don't naturally forgive each other, if you're not naturally generous towards each other, if you're not forgiving and compassionate and loving, it must be because you've never really experienced or have no knowledge of how much God has loved and forgiven you. And here's the second one. He says in verse 26, he says, be angry and do not sin. But notice, it didn't say, don't be angry. And in fact, he commands you on this. He said, be angry and don't sin. To be angry in a loving way. That is because you know that anger is a part of love. When you love something, you're angry at the thing that is hurting it. You see, if I love the person who is dying of cancer, I hate and I'm angry at the cancer that is destroying their body. And because I love my kids, I hate and I'm angry at the moral cancer like dishonesty or rebellion that I've seen destroying their souls. I hate it. I'm angry at it. You see, the problem with our anger, Paul says, is that it's a selfish anger. You see, we want to smack back at a person because of what they did to us. They hit you, so now you hit them back. Or do you punish them for the way that they irritate you through yelling at them? Or maybe your preferred method is the silent treatment. However it is, you're trying to pay them back for how they've hurt you or caused inconvenience to you. Paul says, don't be selfishly angry. That's simple anger. Having loving anger instead. Anger where you're more concerned with bringing healing to the other person than you are with vindicating yourself. And how do you develop such love? That even your anger is bathed in that love and your anger is overcome by such love? Paul says, by thinking of the story of Jesus and letting the Spirit of God transform your heart through that story. You see, Jesus got angry at our sin and he rebuked it. But when it came time for punishment, Jesus took it on himself. Paul says that's why you should be angry. He's not talking about simply ceasing to lose your temper. He's talking about having God's grace totally restructure the way you look at every situation in your life, and in a way that transforms all of your behaviors. So remember the question that we started this session with? Now, what makes Christianity distinctive from every other religion on earth? It's simple. There's one word, and that's grace. You see, Christianity puts forward a morality that is totally different than that of every other religion in history. Every other religion in the world tells you to change. And if you change and if you become good, God will accept you. Now, Paul in the book of Ephesians says that the gospel is the opposite of that. It's the announcement that God has already accepted you as a free gift because of what Jesus Christ did. And in response to that, you should change. In Christianity, good works don't lead to salvation like they do in other religions. If you keep the rules enough and if you do enough good works, you go to heaven. No. In Christianity, good works flow out of salvation. And that makes a huge difference in your heart. You see, if you do good works in order to be saved, then you're not really doing them because you love God, right? You're only doing them because you want to protect yourself. That you're doing it out of self-interest. You see, your heart is going to be filled with fear that God is going to judge you, and pride when you're doing well, or despair when you're not doing well. And those emotions don't lead to true righteousness or peace. They don't lead you to love God. You can't grow in your love for God when you're afraid of Him. Now, Martin Luther was the Catholic monk that has in many ways rediscovered this great truth. That the Bible teaches that salvation is not God's reward for a life of good works, but it's a free gift that God gives to you all who will receive it by faith. Now, the church said at the time, if you tell them salvation is just a free gift, then they will just go around and do whatever they want. And Luther's reply was, no. If people really see that Christ has removed the fear of punishment from them by taking it onto Jesus Christ Himself, they won't go and do whatever they want. They'll do whatever He wants. And this is the gospel change in our lives. And it is absolutely unique in the world. Absolutely unique. That is what we are called to be. That is it for tonight's session of Digital Disciple. Once again, I'm Pastor Travis, and I'm so glad we got to spend this time together tonight. I'm excited to watch as God is taking us from the ordinary into the extraordinary. So until we see each other again, fam, good night and God bless.